Sophie's right to say that I wrote the book because I felt, particularly in the circumstances of the possibility of there being a radical left-wing Labour government for the first time since at least the 1970s, that there was a kind of quite surprising lack of discussion about how the British state would respond. Which I think, you know, was true then, is true now, and is true generally, that the British state, by which I mean all the different institutions of government, the civil service, the courts, the police, the army, sections at least of the media, and Parliament itself, is kind of under-discussed, is under-analysed. And obviously, when you think about it, is a very, very serious question for anyone who wants to see fundamental social change take place. And I think it's not accidental that these things aren't discussed very widely in academia, in the media, even actually on the left. And I think this partly comes from the fact that the establishment, and including all the political parties, don't particularly want to discuss this question. The Tories, because for them the idea that the state is, that most of the institutions of the state, the unelected institutions of the state, and let's be honest and clear here, the vast majority of state institutions are completely undemocratic, have no direct accountability, formal accountability, no process of monitoring or control by ordinary people. And for the Tories, the idea that the state is neutral is an idea that I think they don't really believe in. They certainly semi-consciously understand that that's not really true, but it's clearly a useful idea for them because it means that they can pass off the decisions and actions of the state as being things that are implemented either because Parliament asks them to be implemented or because they're just sensible and useful things for society as a whole. And that's a very, very useful myth for the Tories, for the main party of the British ruling class. And then for the Labour Party, it's this idea of the neutral state is useful as well, is important as well, because their whole project, the historic project of the Labour Party, is that change comes through the institutions, obviously, that, you know, you get a left-wing or a progressive government elected, they make decisions, and then they will be implemented in a fair and kind of acceptable way by the civil service, by the police, by all the different institutions. And so it's kind of, from the point of view of all the political parties, it's kind of embedded in the whole way that the system works. And I think it's worth saying that this idea of a neutral state is kind of made easier by the way that capitalism functions, so in particular the kind of free market versions of capitalism. First of all, because the idea and actually the reality of the society that we live in is that a good deal of it, production, the distribution of goods and so on and so forth, is in general not conducted by the state at all. It's conducted by the market, by private corporations, by big business or small business for that matter. And so you have this notion that the state, the neutral state is kind of underpinned by the reality of the way capitalism works, that, you know, there's this free market, it's called, which is outside of democratic control, which is outside of the kind of, you know, political world, and just carries on functioning and delivers the things that people need. And so because that's the way capitalism works, the idea that the state is somehow separate and kind of above the normal workings of civil society has some kind of traction, because it fits at least in a superficial way, with the way society works. The second reason why I think the myth of the neutral state has a kind of purchase on people's understanding of the world is that some of the things the state does, by no means all, but some of them are things that at least partly need to happen. For example, a health service, for example, the building of, the construction and maintenance of transport systems, all sorts of kind of regulations that affect the way people work and so on and so forth. These are things that any kind of society would need to a certain extent. And so again, the idea that the state is somehow, unlike perhaps the rest of society, is somehow operating in the interests of society as a whole, has a kind of take-up, it has a kind of plausibility that helps to underline this myth. Nevertheless, what I argue in the book, and what I think is the case, is that in reality, this is a myth, that actually the state is not neutral, that actually the state functions by and large in a way that benefits and serves the interests of a small minority in society, actually, essentially, the minority of people who own and control big business and corporate power. And the way that I kind of examine this question in the book is by looking historically at the way the modern British state came into being and developed over the last couple of hundred years. And I just want to make three, very, very briefly, the case for three historical facts about the development of these institutions in British society. And the first one concerns democracy, and I think it's quite important because the myth of the neutral state is bound up with the idea that Britain is in some way, in a sense, kind of the home of democracy, the home of gradual social change. People talk about Westminster as being the mother of all parliaments, and that, Britain has some inherent kind of evolutionary spirit. Its history is marked by compromise and change through negotiation, with Parliament as being the kind of democratic forum that over the years has driven this process. Now, this just doesn't fit the facts. It doesn't fit the reality of what's happened over the last couple of hundred years. In fact, the truth is that you can characterise the 19th century, or the social history of the 19th century, partly or largely by being a period when there were massive popular social struggles to try and win democracy against, actually, the institutions of the British state. And, this idea that somehow democracy was developed through a kind of paternalistic operation by the British establishment, that over time rights were granted because there was some desire to create or to pursue some sort of process of negotiation, is a complete lie. Going right back to the beginning of the 19th century, people know probably about the Peterloo massacre, which was a famous case where a number of people were killed by the most violent forces of the state, precisely in the process of trying to begin the battle for universal suffrage. But it's not just instances like Peterloo. After Peterloo, a decade later, there was the first great working class movement in world history, the Chartists. And that was a movement that involved millions of people in a very, very bitter and strongly fought campaign precisely for the vote. And in the period from the 1830s right up until 1848 and beyond, there was a series of absolutely massive struggles, including big strikes, demonstrations, riots, as well as the actual collection of petitions on the Charter, which were trying to force democratic rights out of an extremely reluctant and very repressive British establishment. So, the idea that Westminster is the mother of all parliaments, and that kind of somehow initiated the process of democracy is actually a complete lie. I mean, Parliament goes back many centuries in terms of its historical existence, most of the time that Parliament has been operating, there hasn't been anything approaching democracy in British society. It wasn't actually until 1928 that we got universal suffrage in this country, which means, by the way, that Britain was about the 30th country in the world to get democracy, and so it wasn't in no sense a pioneer of the idea of democratic change. The second historical point that I make in the book is that most of the institutions of the state took some sort of recognisably modern form during the 19th century, way before universal suffrage came into being. You can talk about the civil service, for example, that was set up essentially in something approaching its modern form in the 1870s, when there was really the vote. There was about 1 million people in Britain who had the vote at that time, and it actually, the way it worked, and the kind of the reasons why it was set up was precisely, and it was set up at the kind of or the initiation of the civil service was driven by what were regarded at the time as being the more kind of forward-thinking and liberal elements of the British establishment. And they set it up, and if you read the documents, some of which I quote in the book, it was set up very consciously in order to limit the impact of democracy if and when it became a reality. There were parts of the liberal establishment who kind of saw the writing on the wall as early as the 1870s, realised that, one person, one vote, or at the time they were thinking more in terms of one man, one vote, was actually going to happen. And so what they wanted to do was to set up a body that would basically administer British society, that would be permanent, that would be unelected, would be there as governments came and went, and the people that ran it would be very much committed to the continuation of an unequal society, a society where profit ruled, a society where private property was at the centre, at the core of the way society operated. So, I mean, it's fascinating reading these documents because they all talk about the fact that, okay, it may no longer have been the case that it was possible to continue a society in which the aristocracy basically ran everything. And up until that time, most of the people running state institutions were aristocrats. They had to open it up a bit. They had to kind of increase the skills base and the gene base of these institutions. But they wanted to make sure these people were loyal to the basic principles of capitalism. So they had to come, certainly anyone in any senior position of the civil service came from Oxford or Cambridge, went to the public schools, and very much the top universities and the public schools were developed to be a schooling for people who would take these positions and be absolutely loyal to the people who ran the economy. So that's the civil service. I mean, the police is an interesting case. The police, in something approaching their modern form, was set up in the 1830s. And again, the documents that record the debates that led to the setting up of the police force are fascinating. And essentially the argument was this, that there was a problem with the way the British establishment had responded to the democratic movements, and Peterloo was an important staging post in this process, because the establishment was worried, the ruling class were worried that actually stabbing and shooting protesters was counterproductive and actually created more bitterness and anger, and was too kind of openly repressive. So the idea was, instead of having people with muskets and sabres taking on the protesters, they would institute a new force of people who, all of them men at the time, who were armed with truncheons and not with actual lethal weapons. And that one of the things that they talked about was they wanted people who had a weapon in one hand, but their other hand should be free in order to arrest people, so they wouldn't be killed. So it was about maiming and then imprisoning people, as opposed to actually executing them. And essentially those, I mean, that sounds like an extreme, a caricature, but actually that is what was discussed at the time. And the police force was set up in, the Metropolitan Police was set up in 1832, I think. And they were used against the Chartists, and they were quite effective actually in lots of different ways. But that was the core kind of reasoning behind the development of the more kind of repressive and kind of, you know, sharp end of the British state as it developed. So that's my second point, really, is that the second historical point is that state institutions were developed before democracy, they were completely undemocratic, and they were deliberately designed to either stop the development of democracy or, in case of further retreat, limit its ability to actually make much of a difference to how society operated. The third point that I make, and I kind of bring the story forward up until through the 20th century, is to say that the history of the rest of the 19th and 20th century was one in which the institutions of the state were used time after time to try and suppress social movements, not just movements for democracy, but other social movements, including the trade unions and so forth, and actually to move against and try and subvert any time there were progressive governments elected into office. And I won't go through, there's a number of examples that I use, but as I say, there was a fairly bloody history of repression of social movements in the 19th century, but it goes on throughout the 20th century as well. I mean, during the general strike in 1926, there were gunboats were deployed in on the Mersey, on the Clyde in Glasgow. There were tanks driving up and down the main roads in East London. Actually, the docks in London were completely rammed with munitions that were shipped in the weeks running up to the general strike, partly for use in case of real disaster from the point of the ruling class, in case the general strike really got out of hand, but also as a way of sending a signal, and I think this was more important, that, you know, if you go too far, the state is there and ready to move against you with real force. The miners' strike in 1984-85, again, there was a very, very serious operation using many of the different wings of the state to intimidate, demonise, and actually suppress what was a kind of crucial industrial dispute that changed the way British history developed. The mining villages were surrounded by police. There's plenty of evidence that soldiers were dressed up in police uniform and deployed against pickets. There was a famous turning point in the strike called the Battle of Orgreave, where a gathering of tens of thousands of miners' pickets were really smashed up with quite extreme brutality. It's been filmed, and there's been quite a few kind of semi-fictional accounts, kind of reenactments of the Battle of Orgreave. But it was a moment of very serious violence, which again was aimed at trying to intimidate and to force the encourage the miners and other trade unionists and their supporters to back off and to realise that they faced overwhelming force if they continued. So that's the movement side of it. I want to say a few words about the way that the more radical Labour governments, such as there have been in Britain, have also been victims of various different and coordinated operations by sections of the state. In 1974, the Wilson government was elected on probably the most radical manifesto there's ever been. Actually, probably a bit more radical than the Corbyn manifesto, actually. They got elected on the back of a series of massive strikes. The Tories went to the Prime Minister at the time, Edward Heath, went to the country in 1974. Such was the level of industrial action at the time, on the asking the question, who runs the country, us, the government, or the unions? And he lost. That gives you an idea of, you know, the kind of state of mind of the population at the time. The government came in. For the first 6 months, it instituted some of its promised reforms, but very quickly it hit a buffer. And without going into the detail of that, which is the book that I'm marked, I only see it, I'll just read you a couple of very, very short bits from Tony Benn's diaries. Tony Benn was the Minister of Industry at the time. He was the most left-wing cabinet minister in the Wilson government, and he was a target from very, very early on of the media, the civil service, various dirty tricks from the secret services, and he writes entertainingly in his diaries, and I recommend people read about what he says about particularly these years in the 70s when he was in office. And he says that on the first day he turns up the Ministry of Industry, and he has this radical agenda for democratising industry, for increasing workers' rights, but also instituting a level of kind of workers' control over sections of industry, nationalising the top 200 companies and so on and so forth. And he goes in and meets the head of the civil service of his department, a guy called Sir Anthony Part. And Tony Benn says that this guy, Sir Anthony Part, treated him, I quote, like a consultant psychiatrist would a particularly dangerous patient. And Sir Anthony Part, the first thing Anthony Part said to Tony Benn was, are you seriously thinking that you can institute your radical economic programme? And Tony Benn said, well, I've been elected, we've been elected, it was in our manifesto, so of course we're going to try and implement our radical economic programme. And Sir Anthony Part replied, well, I must warn you in that case that if you do it, you will be heading for as big a confrontation with industrial management as the last government, i.e. the Tories, had with the trade unions. So, shameless really. This guy's just saying, we're not going to do this, we're part of the establishment, there's going to be a big reaction against what you try and do. In a sense, this is war. And, he wasn't joking, because that is actually what happened. Over the following couple of years, there was a coordinated campaign against the government in general and against Tony Benn in particular, which involved not just civil service obstruction. I mean, Tony Benn said, he'd order his civil servants to do stuff and they just wouldn't do it, but much more wide, sort of more profound attempts to block the programme. There was a run on the pound that was coordinated between the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the Bank of England. There were actually serious attempts, or real attempts. I'm not saying that they actually were close to taking power, but there were real attempts to organise coups, which I think, again, their purpose, they were mainly run by kind of former generals and former civil service people and some people, ex-corporate leaders. I think their main aim was to destabilise the government rather than, they hadn't quite got to the stage of seriously talking about actual coups, but nevertheless, they worked with the current secret services, and they were doing everything they could to undermine the ability of the government to act. And the overall kind of impact of all this was that by 1976, the Labour government felt that they really were in no position to pursue their programme. And all of this kind of obstruction and sabotage strengthened the right in the Labour Party to the point where Jim Callaghan, who took over as Prime Minister from Harold Wilson, decided in 1976 that the whole programme of radical reform, the extra spending on the welfare state, the direct investment and support for companies, the nationalisation programme, and so on and so forth, had to be abandoned. Such was the level of political and economic crisis that had been generated partly by state institutions. And so in 1976 at the Labour Party conference, there was a complete U-turn, austerity was introduced. You can actually trace the kind of beginnings of Thatcherism to that moment under the Labour government. And by the end of the Labour government in 1979, because of this coordinated process between the kind of big corporate institutions, the banks, the right wing of the Labour Party and the state institutions, the Labour government had ended up presiding over the biggest fall in working class living standards since the 1930s. Now, you know, it's a fascinating and tragic history. It laid the basis, actually, for the loss of confidence in social democracy that allowed Margaret Thatcher to get elected in 1979, and it's massively under-discussed. You know, given that that was the last case in which a radical Labour government we have a kind of real-life experiment of what a reforming government would actually look like under conditions of British capitalism. It seems to me that we have to take that very, very seriously. So I'll just 2 or 3 more minutes, if that's all right. I just need to bring it right up to date. Sorry, I've gone a bit too long, but I mean, you know, Sophie's absolutely right to say that I think it's the case. I mean, I was warning about what might happen if Corbyn got elected. Actually, the state manoeuvres against Corbyn started earlier than, you know, even before he got elected. I think you have to say the civil service was briefing journalists about, you know, this guy is senile and unable to run the country. They were also saying he was a security risk. The media was reproducing these arguments. Generals were briefing journalists saying there'd be a mutiny in the military, a top-level mutiny in the military, if a man who wouldn't push the nuclear button ended up in number 10 Downing Street. I think I have to say, I think you have to see the mobilisation of the argument that Corbyn's Labour was institutionally anti-Semitic as being part of a kind of dirty tricks campaign against Corbyn and Corbynism, you know, a whole number of other ways in which he was demonised and his kind of reputation was trashed as being part of the same kind of process that ended up being unfortunately decisive in 2019. So we're now in a moment where, you know, that project is really come to an end. We have a quite right-wing Tory government that is talking about clamping down on civil liberties, that is kind of pursuing quite a frighteningly authoritarian agenda. And I think, you know, this question now becomes important once again. And I think it's, you know, I think it's important for a whole number of reasons that we can discuss, but I think that we have to sort of understand the way in which the failure to discuss these questions seriously is in danger of leaving us in a situation where people still believe that the only way to change things is through electing another Labour government in 5 years' time, or is through the whole process of parliamentary politics. And I think in a way the crucial thing here is that, the very important thing for the establishment of the British ruling class is the extent to which the idea is embedded in British society. The politics is what happens in Parliament, and you know, it can only be conducted by experts, and that it's separate from our everyday lives and our working lives, that there's a separation between politics and economics, and that's the way things always are. The reality, I would argue, and this is how I end the book, is that actually it's at the moments when the separation between economics and politics is overcome, it's at the moments when people start to break down that idea that politics is just something that is done by experts in Parliament, and begin to cross-fertilise between politics and economics. It's at those moments when things change fundamentally. And if you look back over the history of even the last 20 or 30 years of British society, I mean, even very mainstream social histories of Britain have to recognise and accept that actually many of the key turning points, many of the moments when society changed fundamentally have been moments when ordinary people began to take the world, began to take events, began to take politics into their own hands. I mean, I'm thinking about the anti-fascist movement in the 1970s in Britain, which I think had a huge impact on British society. I'm thinking about the miners' strike, which in a negative way had a huge impact on the way that society evolved and allowed Thatcherism to continue. I'm thinking about the poll tax demonstrations. I don't know if people know about them, but in 1990, a massive rebellion against the Tories' flagship tax reform actually led to the defeat and the fall of the Thatcher government and her resignation. I'm thinking about the anti-war movement in Britain at the beginning of this millennium, when, although it didn't stop the war, there's no question the anti-war movement has been kind of defining in the terms of the way British society has developed. So, I don't think it's in any way utopian or fantastical to believe that in reality change can happen when people organise, and that change happens. Obviously it's important to get left-wing parties elected. The Corbyn project helped to popularise socialism. It created a big opening that we've got to make sure doesn't get closed by events as they unfold now. But actually, in reality, the historical record tells you that there's other ways, and actually more effective ways, of instituting change, and that the left needs to understand that the way in which parliamentary politics is embedded in the wider state makes it very, very resistant to change, and that organising more widely, grassroots organisation, campaigning, trade unions, the whole history of radical social movements have actually been much more fundamental to shaping the way society operates than is normally recognised. And precisely at this moment, I think that's a very, very salutary lesson to all of us who feel no doubt disheartened and dejected by the defeat of Corbynism, but nevertheless in a situation where it's clear that we can't wait 5 years to change this government, and that we have to set about the task, set about the job now of trying to make things happen and trying to institute change from below.
Thank you.